speak up?
Governments that committed genocide were defeated by democracies.
Yeah.
Say liberty in Western Europe and Asia.
Okay. Anyone else has any thoughts about this matter? Yes.
It was kind of one of the first steps of the United States becoming the dominant world power, as opposed to, well, at the time opposed to the Soviet Union, but because it defeated, it had such a huge part in World War II, the United States became a superpower, and then later, with Europe in ruins, the United States could sell everything to Europe and
Yeah. All right. Those of you in the back of the room, could you hear what was being said here? Some of you couldn't. So I'm going to request that each one of you speak up a bit, because it is a fairly large room. All right. And we want to make sure that everyone gets heard. Let me take a third comment if someone else has a comment on this, and I just want to share a couple of reflections.
I think one of the most important of these options was the Russian Revolution for what it meant after, which is, the whole Cold War thing. I think it made a big conflict between like capitalist countries and communist countries, and the influence on Latin America and the genocide in Latin America.
Right.
So that one I think is very significant.
Okay. All right. So I think that we can be in agreement about one thing, which is that I think it is plausible to make an argument for any one of these. Now clearly, well, maybe we can't get agreement with that, because very few of you thought that the idea of mass nonviolent resistance is the most important event of the 20th century. All right. I incidentally do think, and if you've gone through the syllabus, you would have noticed that I've put aside one entire lecture for that idea. And last night, shortly before midnight, I emailed you all to inform you of an article that I just published on my blog, which is on Martin Luther King, because yesterday happened to be the 50th anniversary of a speech that Martin Luther King Jr. had given at Riverside Church, which is an extraordinary speech and an extraordinary indictment, of course, of American foreign policy and the addiction to violence and militarism in American history. I mean, that's what it really is, right? Now, the fact that very few of you thought that the idea of mass nonviolent resistance is, in fact, perhaps the most important event of the 20th century is, I think, illuminating, because I want to suggest to you very simply this, without taking a position on it, that, for every 100 books that have been written on violence, there's not even one book that's been written on nonviolence, if you look at it proportionately, right? For 1,000 scholars and anthropologists and sociologists who work on violence, perhaps one has worked on nonviolence. Now, I think that this is important, because what I want to suggest to you is that very often when our gaze is turned upon a subject historically over a long period of time, we tend to reify that object. In other words, what I mean by that is that it's a vicious cycle. That we study violence because we think it is by far the most important thing, right? And we tend to, of course, ignore nonviolence. And of course, this is a liability of the English language already. Nonviolence is the negation of violence. It is the negation of nonviolence. Before you can have nonviolence, you must have violence, so to speak. If you were a student of philosophy, you would say that violence is ontologically grounded. That is, it has a life of its own. Nonviolence is merely something that is a response to it. Right? This is the fundamental problem. And of course, I think the 20th century, which we're going to be spending a lot of time on, is extraordinarily important, because the 20th century was a century of total violence. Total violence. And here I'm speaking not only of World War I and World War II, I'm speaking about the culture of violence that became endemic in the 20th century. I mean, don't forget all the colonial wars, right? Don't forget all the colonial wars. Don't forget the Boer War. Starts in 1898, goes up to 1902. Don't forget the Vietnam War, the Korean War. These are all outside World War I and World War II. And it's not simply the number of people who died in each of these wars. It's not simply a matter of tallying the dead and saying, 150 million, 200. It is the technologies of death which changed fundamentally in the 20th century. But what is particularly interesting is that the 20th century also is the century of the most creative responses to violence. And that is why the 20th century is fundamentally different from the 19th century and 18th century, because if you have studied European history, you know that European history was for a large time actually a history of warfare between European states. You know, the 100 Years' War, as it's called, the 30 Years' War, the 7 Years' War, all of these phenomena. Right? So we had violence before, but what happened in the 20th century, fundamentally two major changes. One, the technologies of death, including, of course, the extreme technology, namely the atomic bombings, right, of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the development of nuclear weapons. But the fact that there was no premium on human life at all. I mean, remember that towards the end of the 20th century, when the US waged war in Iraq, the then Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, described the loss of civilian lives as, quote, collateral damage. That's his phrase, not mine. Collateral damage. So it is the utter diminishment, the degradation of human life, which had become astronomical problem in the 20th century. But the second thing, and that is why I think we have to be particularly sensitive, and that's why I pose a particular question, is that the 20th century gave rise to people like Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Albert Luthuli, and numerous others, and of course Martin Luther King and the whole range of civil rights leaders in the United States. We hadn't had such a response to violence in previous centuries. And I'm also intrigued by the fact that many of you, very few of you, thought that the decolonization of Asia and Africa was not that important relative to the defeat of Germany and Japan. What if it had been the decolonization of white America? Would you have voted differently? I want you to think about that only, right? What if Europe had been colonized in the 20th century by black people, by Africans, and Europe and white America had become decolonized? Okay, would you have voted differently? I'm not insinuating anything at all. I'm simply reflecting on the fact that I think the decolonization of Asia and Africa and the idea of mass nonviolent resistance are in fact actually the two principal events of the 20th century. When we think about the defeat of Japan, in some ways we already have a kind of a Eurocentric defeat of Germany and defeat of Italy. The Axis forces, we already have in some respects a kind of a Eurocentric perspective, I want to suggest to you. Okay? So that's the reason why I posed that particular question. Now, before I launch into a discussion of revolutions, I want to just finish up with what I had been talking to you about in my previous lecture, because I made some preliminary remarks, I'd gone over the syllabus, and I want to take another 10 or 15 minutes to do that, and then we're going to begin formally with trying to look at revolutions, the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, and of course we'll continue that on Friday as well. The first thing I want to suggest to you is that when we do world history, whose world history are we speaking about? Okay? Is it possible to do world history if you are living in a third world city? When we do world history, and here I'm not talking about eurocentrism, I'm talking about the fact that there is always a political economy of knowledge production. Who produces knowledge? Right? For whom? If you look at you would have received, because I as a faculty member receive it, and I'm sure that all of you have received once in a while, and even if you haven't, it really doesn't matter. You would have received from the chancellor of the university an email once every 6 months or once a year saying that, oh, UCLA is number 15 in world rankings, or number 11, or number 13, whatever it is, among the top research universities. Now, if you look at the top research universities, right, they're all in the United States, Germany, of course, some in Britain, Oxford, and Cambridge, and there are a few, not in the top 20 yet, but in the top 50, there are few in China that are slowly creeping up, slowly. None in Asia, none in India, none in Africa, of course, all right? And of course, a couple in France as well, and a couple in Japan. Japan, as you know, is, they used to describe the Japanese as honorable whites, in the 1980s, because Japan had become the premium world economy in the 1980s, and so it was really, in some ways, an extension of the Western world. But you get the idea, right? All of these universities are in the West. And of course, I mean, this is where the resources are. How do you actually write world history if you're living in Accra, in Ghana, or Chennai in India, or Karachi, Pakistan, right? Or, for that matter, in Iraq or Syria, where bombs are falling on people all the time, right? Who produces world history? From what standpoint? I want you to think about that. And one of the reasons why I've assigned a text, which to the best of my knowledge, no one who teaches world history assigns now, but I've assigned pages from this. It's a book called Glimpses of World History by Jawaharlal Nehru. Okay, and this is actually the book, Glimpses of World History. All right? Now, Jawaharlal Nehru was a major figure in the Indian nationalist movement, a close associate of Gandhi. So he's not simply the writer of a book, he's actually the object of our inquiry. He's one of the major figures in world history in the 20th century, because as I'm sure a few of you here certainly know, that when India became independent in 1947, he went on to become the first Prime Minister of Free India, and he was the Prime Minister of India until his death in 1964. And he is one of the major figures behind what is going to be called the non-aligned movement, right, which was a response to the Cold War, countries that wanted to be allied neither with the United States and its friends, nor with the Soviet Union and its friends, countries that created a third front. Now, this book is extraordinarily interesting because he's not a professional historian. And what is it? It's actually a series of letters, right? It's about 1,000 pages, incidentally, right? And Nehru was well, and this is the first American edition. This is not this book was published in the United States as well, all right? It's a series of letters written to his daughter, who was then 15 years old. So let's say about 5-6 years younger than most of you at this point, okay? Than most of you. These letters are written while he's in jail without access to books. There are no footnotes in this book. It's a series of over 100 letters, and it actually spans the entire known history of humankind. Of course, in broad details, right? In broad details. I mean, the man had, of course, a prodigious memory. I mean, remember, he's writing without notes. He's writing from prison. Prison is, by the way, that's another interesting theme I want you to just think about. It is an interesting place for reflections. Many of the great masterworks of literature have come out of people who were in prison. Because it gives you solitude. It gives you the freedom. If Mr. Trump spent a little bit of time there and didn't have access to Twitter, he would be a remarkably different man. Right? It gives you solitude. It allows you to go deep inside yourself. So it's not accidental. It's not accidental that this is written in prison. And what is interesting is that this is a man who's writing with the full awareness of the fact that when he's writing about the French Revolution, which is a portion that you're reading today from this book, that he himself is on the verge, on the cusp of creating a revolution. Because he knows he's a major player in the anti-colonial movement. Right? So he's very much aware not simply of the history that has been made, but of the history that he himself will be making. Right? And it casts a very different reflection on how one looks at something like the French Revolution. Right? So there is some thought, at least on my part, from my understanding of how I have decided that I won't assign this book to you, because I can tell you that if you go to professional historians, they'll say, well, oh, you know, the book was basically a set of rambling letters written to his daughter 70 years ago, you know, it doesn't stand up to the test of time. Well, actually, it does. Incidentally, his narrative of the French Revolution in its broad details is uncontestably the narrative that every historian would accept even today, you know. But it is written from a certain standpoint, not someone who's not just a professional historian, but someone who's writing from the vantage point of a colonized subject. He himself is colonized. And I'm trying to suggest to you that we have to be aware then of what we mean when we speak about world history. Who writes it? What is the political economy of this knowledge production called world history? Number one. Number two, how is world history different from global history, universal history, transnational history? These four phrases are phrases you'll hear all the time. And we don't have the luxury of being able to parse in substantial detail the differences between all four. But I just want to make a few preliminary observations, again, so that you can start thinking about what is this endeavor we are engaged in, called world history, right? Because if you look at history today, what is the predominant unit of analysis? It's the nation state. It's a nation state. If you look at history departments around the United States, and if you look at history books, you know, the vast majority of books, history books, are concerned with the history of a nation state. Now, if they're very, very local in scope, then obviously it will not just be the nation state, it will be a much smaller unit, which could be a city, could be a village, but within the ambit of the nation state. Within the ambit of the nation state. And remember that the principal world body, which is called the United Nations, is itself completely predicated on the idea of the nation state. Right? So when towards the end of the course we turn to the configuration of the world, how did the configuration of the world change after 1945? The particular way in which it changed was simply this, that the principal body charged with keeping peace in the world hasn't done a very good job at it, obviously, namely the United Nations, was completely modeled on the notion of the nation state. Right, so what are the two principal organizations within the United Nations, the two principal bodies? One is the Security Council, and one is the General Assembly. And in the General Assembly, as some of you might know, every country, regardless of its size, whether it's Fiji or whether it's India, that is, whether it is a population of less than 1 billion or whether it is a population of 1.3 billion, every country has one vote. Which is precisely why, of course, the General Assembly is completely impotent. Completely impotent. Because, of course, that's why the Security Council was created, that the powerful nation should be able to force world events, right? Because in the Security Council you have a veto. And there are only 5 countries which, of course, have a veto, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, right? But what is the model? The model is the nation state, right? And when we begin our story in the 18th century, in the mid-18th century, the nation state has already come into existence in an incipient form. It has not been well thought out everywhere, and in most parts of the world, of course, they don't have the nation state at that point. You still have empires, or you have colonized areas. But in Europe, the nation state had begun to emerge, right, with the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century. So now when we speak about, so going back to the question of global history, world history, universal history, transnational history, transnational I think should be obvious to you, right? That people who do transnational histories are suggesting in some ways that we need to go beyond the history of the nation state. Now, and there are many different ways in which you can go beyond the history of the nation state. You can look at organizations that are transnational. What would be an illustration of an organization that's transnational? Greenpeace, right? Amnesty. Right? These are what you might call transnational organizations. Right? Though, of course, Greenpeace and Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and all of these organizations cannot work except without the nation state in the background. Because if the Human Rights Watch wants to go to Syria today to investigate the chemical attack that I mentioned to you, the Syrian government won't allow them. It's as simple as that. So you can see that there are difficulties there. Of course, there are other ways of doing transnational history. It's much more complex. Right? And those have to do with trying to look at various kinds of linkages between different parts of the world. Right? So you can, for example, there are, by the way, economic historians of commodities who do that sort of thing. You look at oil, right? You can write a whole history of the world by looking at a commodity called oil or sugar or corn, and then you say, well, let me look at the price of oil over the period or course of last 50 years in different parts of the world. No, now you're not doing the history of a nation state there, obviously, right? You're in some ways transcending that boundary called the nation state, right? But what is important here is that when we do world history, we are very often describing, okay, the nation state. That is really in some ways the backdrop, and then we're in some ways attempting to transcend that, right? So world history in that way really tries to transcend the problematic of the nation state. Global history, these terms are used very often interchangeably, but global history, you could say, right, is also engaged in that particular enterprise, except that it perhaps questions the nation state entity even more so than world history does. Okay, that is that it may look at time and space in a somewhat different way, and might try to understand these linkages temporally in a different fashion. The phrase universal history is frankly no longer used very much. You still see it, but it used to be used mainly in the 18th century. And so when people are writing universal history, that's a period that we're going to be looking at shortly in a few minutes when we turn to the 18th century. When people were writing universal history, this was the ambition of the Enlightenment thinkers, right? That the entire world is knowable, And I have to say, by the way, again, in some respects, this is a particularly European perspective in some ways. Right? So let me put a question for you here. I'm not asking for an answer as such. I want you to think about it. Is it the case you think? Right? Because if you look at something called universal history, who was writing these universal histories? It was Europeans who were writing these universal histories in the 18th century. Right? So is it the case that Europeans are intellectually more inquisitive than Africans, Indians, Chinese, Aboriginals, and many other people? Right? Is it the case that there is a certain kind of intellectual curiosity that has driven the West? Because after all, if you look at, for example, a research university like UCLA, the running assumption here is that the world is knowable, right? That the economists and the sociologists and the historians and the anthropologists seated here together between themselves, they have a mastery of the world, or at least would like to have a mastery of the world. And is this a particularly European way of thinking about who the subject is, who's looking into that world, and then the object of that inquiry? Right? So those are some set of preliminary questions about world history, transnational history, global history, and universal history. Thirdly, there has been something of a shift in how world history is written. What is that shift? That shift predominantly is simply the fact that people who do world history have become much more sensitive to the question of, quote, eurocentrism. Right? So that's, of course, one way of saying that the idea of the nation state as a unit, is being contested, but it's also a question of saying that, well, why should it be the case that Europe should be the center of this history? Because I want to suggest to you now something very radical, and this thought doesn't originate with me. There are a number of other scholars and thinkers who will be moving in that direction as well. And it's a very radical idea for you at this stage, but I want you to think about it. Namely, that no matter which history you do outside the history of Europe, you could be doing Indian history, you could be doing Chinese history, you could be doing the history of the Middle East. In some ways, you are always performing European history. In some ways, you are always just doing that, because that's the template. What do I mean? Let me give you a simple illustration. Okay? Let me give you a very simple illustration. It has long been argued by some Marxist scholars that India never had in the 20th century a real revolution. Now, I have always been puzzled by that observation. Puzzled is a mild way of putting it. I've also been enraged by it, so forth and so on. What is that argument? The argument is that Gandhi and mass nonviolent resistance did not produce a real revolution. Right? Because look, what is the subject for today, for Friday, and next Monday? It's the idea of revolutions. What is a revolution? A revolution, as opposed to, the obvious contrast is with evolution. Evolution is a slow change, right? We evolve. Human beings evolve. The story of humanity is a story of evolution. Right? Revolution is turning things upside down. A dramatic change. What happened in France in 1789 to 1795, 1796, approximately 6-7 years. You could even say a decade, until the advent of Napoleon, and the 18th Brumaire, right? That you could say, let's say 10 years. It was a dramatic change. Kings fell. The idea of the divine rights of kings was demolished. The masses emerged for the first time to become players in history. That's a revolution. So what do these Indian Marxists say? Well, India never had anything like that, because Gandhi was never in favor of this kind of dramatic upside down. However, what is the idea of mass nonviolent resistance, if not revolutionary? Right? The notion that you confront your opponents who are armed with nonviolence is a radical idea. But somehow, no, this is not a revolution. Why? Because the only real revolution would be something like a French Revolution or the Russian Revolution of 1917. That's a real revolution. When you can see heads falling, you can see people being killed. Yeah, that's a real revolution. Right? So India is, to use a phrase of another historian, it's always sitting in the waiting room of history. We're just waiting for the real revolution to arise. History occurs somewhere else. That's in part what I mean when I say that it doesn't matter whether you are doing history of India or Africa, Ghana, Somalia, Ethiopia, right? Africa is, we shouldn't always be speaking just of Africa, continent. There are countries there, right? There are countries there. It doesn't matter which country's history you are doing. In some ways, it is always the template of Europe which is in the background, always. Right? And that's a fundamental issue when we do world history, I want to suggest to you. So what was I saying? I was saying that there's been a shift. But that shift has been what? Away from eurocentrism, but it has not been sufficient. Why? Because what has really been produced are simply certain kinds of what you might call tinkering, right? So what do I mean by that? So if you look at a world history textbook 30 years ago, okay, an ordinary world history textbook, and you might say that, okay, let's count the number of pages on India and China, and now you count the number of pages on India and China and Africa, it's grown. But has the template really changed? Is it the case that Europe is no longer the center of that history that has been dislodged? Right? That is, I think, very, very questionable. So there has been some kind of shift, but it may not have been sufficient. We can't simply count the number of pages devoted to women's history. Let's take something like that, because you can certainly say that, if you look at a world history textbook written 3 decades ago, let's take the most sophisticated of these books, the most sophisticated in some ways at that time, William McNeill, Rise of the West. Okay, how many pages does he spend on women's rights, women's history? Very few. Now, if you look at world history, yeah, there'll be number of pages. Does that mean that we have better histories today? I'm not sure. Right? Because I don't think it's simply a matter of enumerating these changes in this particular fashion. Right? If we're simply filling in the holes and saying, there are these holes, and most of identity politics on an American university campus, such as this one, is filling in the holes. I'm an Asian American, so I come here 25 years ago and I say to myself, no one is really working on Indian Americans, so let me do that. Things are to be studied not simply because no one else has studied them. They have to be intellectual, philosophical, epistemological arguments for why a subject is intrinsically important. Right? And I'm saying that what's happened is that, in fact, world history textbooks have, in fact, in some ways, made some accommodations that become somewhat sensitive, but they haven't really probed the question of who speaks for whom, with what authority. And that is where we go back to the question of who writes these world histories. From where are they written? Right? And what conception of the world do they have, and what conception of history do they have? All right, so these are some preliminary observations. And with this, before I launch into my first lecture, into the formal remarks, does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask thus far from what has been mentioned? Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to turn to the, I'm going to turn to the PowerPoint here. I want to turn to the question of revolutions. Now, I've made some preliminary remarks about revolutions, okay? And the fact that we have someone like Jawaharlal Nehru, who is, the reading that's been assigned to you is as I said, from glimpses of world history. The Industrial Revolution is something I'm going to turn to later on. But I want to highlight one difference immediately. When the French Revolution occurred, commenced in 1789, the people who were in the midst of that knew that they were creating a revolution. Those people who were living in England when the Industrial Revolution, and that's a phrase that is used by all the historians, right? Industrial Revolution, you've heard it. Circa 1750, 1760, roughly, around that time. And the Industrial Revolution, unlike the French Revolution, did not last for 5 years. Right? It lasted for decades, and some places are still going through the Industrial Revolution. Right? Because there are some places in the world where you have an array of technologies, the most sophisticated and the most primitive, existing side by side, right? Existing side by side. I mean, there are people I know in villages in India who now, I'm talking about farmers, and the same thing is true, by the way, of Ethiopia and China. You go to the remotest part of these countries, and the farmers there are using their cell phones, right, to find out the latest price for corn, or wheat, or rice. All right? So they have access to the latest technologies. But on the other hand, this is, of course, a very limited conception of the idea of technology. Right? This is the overt meaning of technology, but technologies have very many different kinds of meanings. Right? On the other hand, these are people whose lifestyle in many other respects, is actually not being substantially different over the course of the last several hundred years, in some respects. Right? So their technologies of social intercourse are very often 17th, 18th century, even at the same time that they are 2017. All right? This is what I'm trying to suggest to you. Okay? So what is the point I'm making here? Let me put it into the starkest terms. That those who lived through the Industrial Revolution, especially in the early decades, didn't know that they were living through a revolution. They didn't know that. Right? So, you know, if you were living in England in 1760, 1770, 1780, right, moving into the late 1700s or early 1800s, it's not as though the people in England, and I say England because England was the first site of the Industrial Revolution. Right? It's not as if these people really thought of themselves as revolutionaries or as agents of a revolution. They perceived that there was some kind of social change going on. The question is whether this degree of social change was dramatically different from the change to which they were habituated from before. Because there is always change. We should never assume that societies are just stagnant. This is one of the ways in which, of course, the history of large parts of Asia and Africa was written by Europeans, that these societies were stagnant. No, they're not stagnant. Right? There's always social change going on. The degree of social change might differ considerably, all right, from one period to another. But what I'm saying to you is that when we're thinking about revolutions, so if you look at this slide here, the late 18th century, thinking about revolutions. So we have 1760, Industrial Revolution begins in Britain, approximately 1765, invention of the steam engine, which is going to make possible, of course, accelerated production of manufactured goods, eventually, right? 1776, the Declaration of Independence, that is of the American colonists from Britain, and then 1789, beginning of the French Revolution. So that's roughly three decades. I'm saying the fundamental difference between the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution, number one, is that those who were partaking in the French Revolution knew what they were doing. They were not always in control of what they were doing. That's a very different proposition, but they knew. Right? And it's not only the leaders, it's those who were the masses. Right? And that's what I mean, that there is this dramatic, okay, as Edmund Burke put it, you know, in his reflections on the revolution in France, the cashiering of kings. When the heads of kings get toppled, you know that there's some fundamental change going on. And of course, when we go through very briefly, we're not going to spend a lot of time going through the history of it because that's a whole course in itself, the history of the French Revolution. But just a few important details, the progression, we understand that they knew something dramatic was happening. Whereas those who were living in the midst of the Industrial Revolution did not really understand it. It's only retrospectively, much later on, that people began to call what was happening in England in 1760, 1770, and thereafter the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't called the Industrial Revolution at that time. All right? Now, so what is the French Revolution? All right? Let's set it up very briefly. Just have a few minutes left, just a couple of minutes. Let me just set it up very briefly when we speak about the French Revolution. All right? What we are interested in are principally three things. And I'm going to begin with that in my lecture on Friday. One, a very brief enumeration of the major phases through which it goes. Okay, the calling of the estates by Louis XVI, the three estates. You know, what are the consequences? That's number one. Is briefly the phases and chronology. Number two, what might have been some of the global implications of the French Revolution? And what are some of the global implications that continue down to the present day? So I think it was, it might not have been, I don't think it was Mao, I think it was another Chinese leader, I forget who, I think it might have been Chow and Lai, I can't remember, but he was asked, what do you think of the French Revolution? So this is about the 1950s, 1940s, and he said it's too early to tell, right? It's too early to tell. 150 years later, he's saying it's too early to tell, because of course the rumblings of the French Revolution in some fashion or the other continued, right? So that's the second thing that we're interested in. And then thirdly, what we're going to be talking about on Friday is a few of the more interesting features, such as, for example, the guillotine. Okay, you know that Louis XVI was guillotined. Many of the leaders of the revolution were guillotined. So we're going to look at a few isolated aspects of it to try to understand the cultural history of the French Revolution. All right, so we stop here for today, and we're going to continue with this on